and I'm going to give you an overview on disease identification and management. And some of y'all have heard this. I apologize, but try and go through it again. Of course, the first thing we need to do is diagnose the problem that we have with any crop, uh, and we use symptoms and signs. And this is general information, but it's really important. Jen's got the diagnostic lab there, and she diagnoses from these two things as well, symptoms and signs. So some of these we can do in the field. We can look at these plants and figure out what the problem is pretty easily. Other ones, we have to send them in and get this done with a microscope. So, the signs are the visual evidence of the pathogen, whether it be a bacteria or a fungus, and the symptoms are like your leaf spot, your wilt, the response to that infection. Okay. So you've got basically, abiotic diseases are really important. And I think this year, probably with this drought, we're going to see a lot of these abiotic type diseases. Nutritional deficiencies, nutrient toxicities, chemical injury, soil moisture imbalances, uh, and basically they don't spread. Now they can affect everything at once, but they don't spread from plant to plant. So it's a response to an environmental condition or a toxicant of some kind or a soil condition. Probably, I know Lynn has talked about this in his newsletters, but blossom end rot's a big problem here in Oklahoma because we have a lot of wind and fluctuations in soil moisture. So that really is what the induction of this calcium deficiency is. It's hot, windy conditions, uneven soil moisture, and growing susceptible varieties. You can see in this upper left-hand corner there, if you see this blossom end rot on these plum type tomatoes, like if you grow Roma, that's an indicator variety for blossom end rot. So if you think you're going to have blossom end rot, and you've got Romas out in the garden, you can get almost 90 to 100% blossom end rot. Okay. Herbicide injury. We see a lot of that this time of year when pastures start getting sprayed and lawns getting treated, and you've got tomatoes planted out in the field. God only knows what's going to happen when we get these phenoxy herbicide-resistant soybeans and cotton planted all over the state, and farmers start spraying large acreages with phenoxy herbicides. That's going to be a real interesting thing with vegetable gardening. But we see this twisted growth. The twisting or the deformation is often most severe up in the growing point. I took this slide down in the lower right here in southeastern Oklahoma when we were doing a field tour one year, and you notice that almost all the plants were affected. There was some squash affected nearby, so you'll see it in weeds, but it mimics a virus because it gets in the growing point. Herbicide drift. Now I want to cover biotic diseases. These are ones plant pathologists like myself more typically cover. These are bacteria, fungi, viruses, and nematodes, and these spread from plant to plant, and they can increase in severity over the year. Keep in mind, there's entire books written on tomato diseases, so these are just the ones that I've seen over the years that are common in Oklahoma. Bacterial diseases, we have a lot of those. And here's a bacterial culture. It's just kind of a slimy organism there, and you can see those single cells. Occasionally, here's a tomato plant with bacterial wilt. This is mainly a problem in way southeastern Oklahoma, but we've seen it in a few scattered other locations around McAllister, etc. But you get bacteria growing inside the stem. Very stubborn disease to control, but you can actually see it flowing out of the stem if you stick that stem in a tube or a glass of water. More commonly, we have leaf bacterial diseases, and if you cut the leaf, you get and put it under a microscope, you can see the bacterial streaming coming out of those spots on the leaves, and that's a pretty good diagnosis of a bacterial disease. And these are the ones that we have that are most common: bacterial speck, They look very similar on a leaf. I think the most important thing to recognize is you've got a bacterial disease versus a fungus disease. That's the most important distinction. Which bacterial leaf spot you have, whether it be speck that causes these little spots on the fruit, or if you have spot, which looks similar on the leaf, it'll fire up the foliage as well. But you'll notice there's discrete spots in those leaves. That's how we recognize these leaf spot disease. It's not just a scorch on the edge of the leaf. And spot causes these larger spots on the fruit. This was a chronic problem at Bixby, you know, when we had vegetable trials there, and I have this in my garden. I've had it ever since I bought my house. There was a garden back there, and I started planting it, and I've got these bacterial diseases in there every year. We have some cankers. We have this one here is pith necrosis, but we also have bacterial canker. Not as common in gardens, but we've seen it. Fungal diseases, you know, a fungus is a mold, and grows on Petri plates. You can cut these spots here. Here's septoria leaf spot. This is pretty common in central and northeastern Oklahoma. Probably the most common fungus disease of the foliage. Get these needle-like spores when you put them under the scope. Early blight, concentric rings. This is probably more common in southeastern Oklahoma. There's the fungus there. And all these things do the same thing. All these foliar diseases, whether they be bacteria, fungi, do the same thing. They fire up the foliage starting from the bottom of the plant upwards. And you can often make quite a few tomatoes, but you'll make more if you control these. You'll get less sunburn if you control them because you get exposed fruit there that gets sunburned. So it kind of depends on if you really want to try and manage these or just take the tomatoes you get and go along. So I'll talk about the management more specifically of those in a minute, but your soil-borne diseases, these are diseases that come from the soil. Fusarium wilt, you get a yellowing of parts of the plant. If you cut into the wood, you'll see the browning in the wood there at the base of the plant. That's our most common soil-borne fungus disease. Viruses, these are submicroscopic particles, mostly spread by insects. We use, Jen will use various ELISA tests. We have these dipsticks now that do the same thing, but they're an immunological test for viruses. So in the diagnostic lab, Jen will use those to identify viruses. They're mostly spread by aphids and leafhoppers. Here's an example, a cartoon of, you know, an aphid carrying a virus into a field, and this is basically what happens. Oftentimes you don't see the aphids because they move about and leave the virus behind. Probably our most common virus disease has been this beet curlytop virus, and this is not spread by an aphid, and it's kind of an atypical virus disease because you don't see various parts of the plant affected. It seems like the whole plant's affected rather than the growing point. You get purple leaves, they curl up. Here's the virus. It's called a Gemini virus. And it's spread by this leafhopper. We don't know a lot about the biology of this leafhopper. It apparently, some years moves through in fairly high numbers and it leaves this virus behind. We don't see these leafhoppers being a severe problem on tomatoes. But when the leaves start rolling up, that's an issue, and the plant stops growing. What fruit is there turns red prematurely. That's a beet curlytop virus. You'll see a few of these scattered out in little commercial plantings. About 10 years ago, we had a lot of it where 50% of the plants had this or more. So this was in Bixby that year we had that outbreak. You can see all those skips where the plants were removed, and then there's even more showing symptoms. So it was pretty devastating that year. But typically, we just see 1 or 2 plants in a planting. You know, I see it in my garden every couple of years. I'll have, you know, out of 20 plants, I'll have 1 or 2 usually that get curlytop, and that's about it. Now, nematodes are an important problem on tomatoes. And mainly we have root knot nematode, and these survive by eggs. So this was over in around Coyle on some sandy ground there. Uh, Pretty severe root knot infestation. I think Payne County here is the epicenter for tomato root knot. We seem to have a lot of it in this county, and I know I have it in my garden as well. It was another thing that when I bought the place, planted tomatoes, soon realized I had root knot in there. Here are some treatments that we put out compared to where we didn't put treatments out. Now this was, and here, of course, when you pull the plants up, this one's really easy to diagnose. So if plants are crashing mid-season, after they start setting fruit, they're stunted and start going downhill, and it doesn't look like curly top. Pull one or two up and look for these root knots on the roots. This was over by Hara, where a farmer, a market garden guy, had a resistant variety to the right and a susceptible variety here in the middle. And you can see the difference there in resistant and susceptible varieties. Of course, with fusarium wilt and with root knot nematode, the best way to control these soil-borne diseases with resistant varieties, something that says F. It's got an F designation for fusarium wilt, or an N as in neighbor, or designation for nematode resistance. They're fairly effective, and particularly when combined with rotation, some kind of rotation to break disease cycles. Of course, in gardens, that's pretty tough, but you can move these things around. I always plant sweet corn and tomatoes, my two main things that I grow in my garden. I flip-flop those back and forth every year, and I plant a nematode-resistant variety, and I've been able to live with root knot nematode. Soil solarization is another option. I've got a fact sheet written on soil solarization that we updated about a year ago. That's an option for these soil-borne diseases as well. A good practice is to increase organic matter in the soil. This is often very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of labor, but if you're dealing with raised gardens, raised beds, or small plots, you can bring in a lot of compost and that kind of thing. Nematodes don't like that. Most of your disease organisms don't like microbial competition, so anytime you can do that, that's a good thing to do. The healthy seed in the transplant is really important, but it's really hard to carry this out because there's no certification process for seed and for transplants. So when you buy transplants, you just can't, you got to inspect them. But again, you can have a lot of those bacterial diseases are epiphytes, meaning they grow on the surface of the plant, and then under certain conditions they invade the plant, so they can carry a lot of diseases. So you need to inspect them for symptoms, but that you're not going to guarantee that you're not going to bring in some kind of disease when you start bringing in transplants. And of course, I talked about the varieties, the VFN, verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, nematode, and there's a whole string of these designations for disease resistance. We should really be recommending the most current disease-resistant varieties, in my opinion. Another good thing is to stake or cage plants. Use drip irrigation to keep the foliage dry. Don't work the plants when they're wet. And I'll talk a little bit about fungicide and bactericide spray programs. If you have clientele that want to try and control these foliar diseases, this is the way to do it. Grafting is another thing that's popular now. The heirloom varieties and growing these older, going back to the good old days and growing these non-productive varieties, but they taste really good, but they don't make many tomatoes, and they're susceptible to a lot of diseases like fusarium wilt and nematodes. You can actually graft onto a rootstock. Most of your seed companies, if you go to these websites, you can buy grafting rootstocks, a seed for rootstocks, and you can take your favorite heirloom variety and graft it on there. And this helps with, of course, with root knot nematode and fusarium wilt. NC State's got a pretty good little website on grafting, and that's what it is there. There's been some of this tried here in Oklahoma. I know over in Coyle, Wayne Whitmore told me he tried some grafting, and he didn't feel it was any better than he was growing, improved varieties with disease resistance, and he didn't feel like it was worth the effort because he was getting similar results. So this would be probably more amenable to your heirloom varieties. I want to talk a little bit about some work we did way back when, looking at trying to control these diseases. This was a trial over in Bixby where we put bactericides and fungicides on tomatoes. We got on a spray schedule. We actually inoculated these things and with bacterial spot and speck. And we got on a preventive application of spraying every 7 days. We started in May about now. I noticed my tomatoes are blooming now. So we started about bloom and early fruit set, and we sprayed until July. It's a lot of applications there. We used chlorothalonil, which homeowners can buy. It's a protectant fungicide, so if you're dealing with septoria or early blight, this is what you'd want to use. We also use some mancozeb. Homeowners can buy this if they can find it. There's one brand of it. And we also use these coppers. These are more suited to bacterial diseases, copper hydroxide and copper sulfate. These are also readily available to home gardeners. And some of these are also approved for organic production. So we either used Bravo or Kocide by itself, or we started mixing the two together. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we had some disease in there, but it wasn't like it was wiping out the tomatoes. It wasn't until late in July where we started seeing significant defoliation. You can see this slide here shows our check. We were up around 50% disease here in July. And we got pretty good control until about middle of June, and then we started increasing even in our spray plot. So bacterial diseases, by the way, are very stubborn to control. So we're not going to get 100% results with anything, and the coppers are the best materials we have for those. And this is the kind of symptoms that we saw. You see those discrete leaf spots there. It's not just a scorch. If you just see a scorch, that's going to be your wilts or your, environmental problems with roots. But we see discrete spots there, and you're starting to get defoliation in the lower canopy. That's what we saw that year. There's a treated plant to the left, untreated to the right. And this slide shows which treatments were most effective. If you looked at defoliation, we only lost about 25% of the foliage. But the Kocide, of course, with bacteria, the fungicide is not going to be effective, so the Bravo is not very effective. With Kocide and Kocide mixed with the fungicides, we got significant reductions in the amount of disease. Now, most importantly, of course, is yield. We got pretty large yield increases. We didn't get any response with the fungicide because it was bacterial disease. And we made a lot of tomatoes where we didn't spray, but we made 50% more where we did spray with either Kocide or the Kocide mixed with the Bravo or mancozeb. So that's kind of where we're at with these foliar diseases. It takes a spray program and a preventive one to deal with these things. And it takes a lot of effort on the part of the gardener or grower to pull this off. So in summary, spray programs provide partial disease control. I think you'd get better results if you had septoria or early blight. We've never been able to find a location where those are the primary problem. At Bixby, where we did this work, and I know in my garden I have mostly these bacterial leaf spots. Uh, Coppers are a good option, and some of these are organic. If you go to the county agent's handbook, the first couple of pages there, I've got home brands listed of chlorothalonil, copper, sulfur, various fungicides that homeowners can use. But it's really important that they're sprayed preventively. And I would say, in summary, the yield increase was larger than what we expected, based on the amount of disease we had. So in summary, I think it's very important that we identify the disease that we're dealing with, know if it's a bacteria or a fungus, if it's foliar, if it's soil-borne, because you don't want to be spraying these things out there and spending all this time trying to control a leaf disease when you've got root knot nematode, for example. Or you don't want to spray chlorothalonil week after week and have the plant become blighted with bacterial disease. So it's really important that we get these things identified. Sometimes we can identify them by looking at them. Sometimes we need to send them into the clinic there and get a really good idea on these things. Because my experience is when you get into having disease problems on crops like tomatoes, they tend to reappear every year. Now, a lot depends on the weather, but they get into the system there, and it's hard to get rid of them. The same ones tend to crop up year after year. Keep in mind that if you're going to get into a spray program, they're only effective on your foliar diseases. They're preventive, unlike insects, where we encourage people to go out and look and count the number of insects and don't treat until you have a lot of insect. It's not that way with diseases. You've got to get out there in front of the diseases and anticipate the problem. So early fruit set, about now is when you'd want to start spraying if you were in a typical year where you were getting rain, or if you live in southeastern Oklahoma right now where you're getting plenty of rain, this is when you'd want to start spraying for these foliar diseases. You have to realize that these fungicides and bactericides act like paint to protect leaves. It's kind of like painting a 2x4. If you leave it out there and let it start to rot and then try and paint it, it's going to go ahead and rot. Very similar situation with diseases on plants. We cannot cure the diseased leaves, and it's important to maintain a schedule. Mostly on your vegetable crops, a 7-day schedule is what's used to control diseases, cucurbits, powdery mildew, these kinds of things. If it's hot and dry, you can extend that to every 2 weeks. I want to say a little bit. I know this is Eric Rebeck's area, but I want to talk about spider mites. And the reason I want to talk about those is they're a big problem. They're often confused with disease because they blight the foliage. Sometimes they start at the bottom and work their way up, and people think they have a disease and they have mites. And we've been in a drought cycle here for 3 or 4 years now, and they're a major problem. The best control for mites is 2-inch rain. We don't have many of those anymore. They're a severe problem. Oftentimes, early on, you need some kind of hand lens to identify them. But here's a picture of some spider mites out in the field, speckling on a few leaves. You'll see it a few leaves, either mid to lower canopy, and they can explode very quickly when the foliage stays dry and there's any stress, moisture stress at all with the foliage. And here they start showing up. You don't need a hand lens now. You can kind of see the webbing on a few of these leaves, and you can often see them crawling around there. But hopefully we can get some rain and get some good management practices in our tomatoes and have good tomato production like this slide here. Okay, that's my presentation.